Brainworms. If you've been pretty much anywhere on the internet in the last year or so, you've probably heard that the United States HHS department head, RFK Jr., has these. However, some of you might be assuming that all of his idiotic decisions over the last few months has been a result of these brainworms living inside his head. However, that's not true, and that's unfair to the worms, as these worms actually have some really cool biology and some unique life cycle caveats that make them really interesting, and I don't like them getting a bad reputation from hanging out with RFK Jr. But before I go into describing the life cycle of these parasites, some interesting stories about them related to the Orthodox Jewish community in New York in the 1990s, please make sure to like and subscribe, as it really does help this channel grow and let more people learn about the fascinating world of parasitology. So when talking about brainworms, there are actually a few different species we could be talking about. Now, pretty much all of these instances tend to be uncommon and are normally accidental or incidental parasite exposures from wildlife, so you don't really have to be too worried about them in general. However, probably the most common brainworm in people is actually the one that RFK has, and it is...
Who's that Pokemon?
Taenia solium, commonly called the pork tapeworm. Now, when you imagine tapeworms, you're probably thinking about these super long, thin, rope-like worms. And that's pretty accurate, as adult tapeworms typically are fairly long and segmented, with this particular parasite, Taenia solium, able to reach sizes of 7 meters in length, which if you were to hold it straight up would be about 1.5 meters taller than a giraffe. However, this isn't what's in RFK's goal, because tapeworms actually have 2 different stages in their life cycle, and the one that impacts RFK isn't the adult stage. But let me describe the life cycle in a little bit more detail so we can be on the same page going forward. So the same way I describe every life cycle, let's start off by describing the stage people are most familiar with, these large adult worms. These bad boys live in your gut, where they passively absorb some of the nutrients from each one of your meals. They have no mouths, but they actually absorb food directly into their bodies the same way your intestines do, so directly through the skin, and that's actually one of the reasons they're so thin, because it helps with their ability to absorb food. These long bodies are made up of smaller segments, and these segments are called proglottids. Now, as you go from the head of the tapeworm to the end, these proglottids will become progressively larger and more mature, with the end segments just popping off so they can be passed in your stool, and they typically look like some kind of rice, with each proglottid having between 50,000 and 100,000 tapeworm eggs, so kind of acting like a little coin purse for parasite eggs. Now, the way this life cycle is supposed to go is that in areas with poor waste management and possibly poor hand hygiene, some of these eggs will make their way to a pig. And once in the pig, the eggs will receive a chemical cue from the digestive juices in the pig's stomach, and then they will hatch in the gut. In this scenario, pig is what we would call an intermediate host, and like many other parasites in their intermediate host, the parasite will then penetrate the gut and enter the bloodstream, where it will be carried all over the body in a somewhat random way. It will start to insist in the muscles, liver, and even the brain tissue of the pig. Once happily nested inside the pig's tissue, the parasite will then just go on to wait patiently for the pig to be butchered and eaten by a person. And if the parasite is lucky, the pig meat won't be fully cooked, as cooking meat all the way through can kill these worms. Once the parasite cyst inside of the pig tissue is eaten by a person, and it wasn't killed by cooking it too thoroughly, the parasite will then go on to break out of its cyst and then become that stereotypically large segmented worm that people imagine it to be inside of a human's gut. Now, nearly all tapeworms have this 2-host life cycle in which the parasite insists in some kind of other animal that is then eaten by another animal. This process is called trophic transmission, or the transfer of a parasite between hosts through a predator-prey dynamic. Hearing this, you might be saying, worm talk, that sounds pretty interesting, this life cycle is cool, but it doesn't really explain how RFK Jr. got this parasite in his brain, and if anything, it makes him sound more like the pig in this scenario. Well, you're not wrong. You see, humans and pigs have pretty similar digestive systems, so when a human accidentally eats a pig tapeworm egg, the cues that the parasite relies on are very similar and acts as if the human that ate it is the intermediate host rather than the definitive host, and it will enter our bloodstream and randomly insist throughout our body. For other tapeworm species, this isn't a problem, such as the closely related cow tapeworm, because their guts are distinct enough from a human's that the tapeworm eggs will actually just pass through without causing any issues, as they don't receive the right cues to hatch. But this isn't the case with the pig tapeworm. And this is almost certainly what happened to RFK Jr. He was exposed to pork tapeworm eggs, which then hatched in his gut and migrated randomly through his body, with some of them ending up in his brain. But obviously, this brings up the following question. Well, how did he actually get exposed to these eggs? Are they just kind of everywhere? Is it really common? Well, Mr. Kennedy has done a lot of traveling through his career, and much of this traveling is in regions where this tapeworm is endemic. And endemic just means that a disease is always present within a population in a geographic area, typically year-round. So what likely occurred in Mr. Kennedy's case is that during his travels, he went to buy some food, and the person that happened to be preparing his food happened to have an adult tapeworm currently residing in their gut. And after using the bathroom, this person unfortunately did not wash their hands as well as they could have, and thus they brought some eggs from the bathroom into the food they were preparing for RFK, which led to him getting exposed to the tapeworm eggs. Now, when this parasite gets into a person, the disease is called cysticercosis because the little cysts formed by the parasite, and when it gets into someone's brain, it is called Neurocysticercosis. And although this disease is relatively rare in the US, with the CDC estimating about 1,000 cases per year, it may sound familiar as it was the disease featured in the pilot episode of House MD.
So, where there's ham, there's pork. Where there's pork, there's Neurocysticercosis.
Tapeworm? You think she's got a worm in her brain?
Now, the person who had the adult tapeworm likely had no clue that they were actually infected, so there was no malice in this, as adult tapeworms, although huge, actually cause exceedingly little pathology, with most infections completely asymptomatic. And no, tapeworms don't make people lose weight. That is a common myth, and I actually might make a follow-up video on common parasite myths in the future, so let me know if you want to hear that. Back to Mr. Kennedy. Following his initial exposure to the parasite, RFK likely had no symptoms, or they were very mild at the very most, as this parasite is actually very good at staying under the radar, typically not alerting our immune system as it travels through our body. However, as the parasites age and the cyst stage becomes older, they will begin to degrade and eventually die. And as this happens, our immune responses are alerted to the cyst being in our body. Now, if it's in your brain during neurocysticercosis, this can cause some unpleasant side effects, such as headaches, vomiting, and the most common symptom being seizures, which impact about 75% of people with neurocysticercosis and is believed to be one of the main causes of adult-onset epilepsy in endemic regions. In developed countries, neurocysticercosis isn't that common, and this is primarily due to the fact that we have successfully interrupted the life cycle of this parasite. For instance, in the US, pigs are routinely screened for tapeworm cysts by the FDA, and we have fairly good waste disposal infrastructure, making it hard for the parasite to establish its life cycle. This being said, the CDC still estimates that there are about 2,000 cases of neurocysticercosis every year in America, making it rare but not unheard of. And in the US, Hispanic males tend to be the most impacted population by neurocysticercosis. However, in the 1990s, there was a peculiar outbreak amongst Orthodox Jewish population in which 4 people spontaneously developed seizures, which after testing was found to be caused by larval pork tapeworms, the same that RFK has. But here's the interesting thing. Orthodox Jews do not eat pork, so how would they have encountered this parasite at all? Well, it turns out this community had recently hired several new housekeepers to aid around the house, helping with numerous chores such as cooking and cleaning. These women had recently emigrated from Latin America in countries where pork tapeworms are endemic, and as such, one of the housekeepers had an active tapeworm infection, which unfortunately led to her accidentally exposing her employers to the eggs of T. solium when she prepared their food. Clinical manifestations of neurocysticercosis are correlated to the number and size of the lesions, and from my understanding through reading a few of the articles written about RFK's case, he seemingly only has one individual lesion, which would explain why he never seemed to develop any of the negative aspects of this parasite. Although that didn't stop Mr. Kennedy from using his brainworm and an unrelated high mercury level to suggest that he had less earning power due to cognitive issues during a divorce proceeding to his second wife, though that's not really related to the topic we're talking about today. All this said, although RFK has made some really terrible health decisions for this country, particularly around the world of vaccines and autism, this parasite isn't actually related to any of his really idiotic ideas or his bad decision making, as this could happen to a lot of people, and it's really unfair to blame this pretty cool and unique parasite on all his bad decision making. So you asked for it and I delivered. I talked about RFK's brainworm, as many people asked me to do. So if there's any other parasites you want me to talk about or any other parasite related topics, please let me know in the comments, as I really do like these suggestions. They're fun, and this was a really fun video to make. While you're down there, please make sure to like and subscribe, as it does help me, get a little ego boost every time I see a nice comment or a like on a video. So thank you for your time. Have a nice one. Stay safe.